Hello and welcome. In this lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about climate change and the ways in which the impacts of changing climate affects different groups differently. Some groups are more vulnerable to these types of environmental impacts. And as we go forward, we need to think about how we can ensure that there's justice in terms of allocation of resources and supports, and also ways in which we can help support communities in being resilient in the face of various different challenges that they're going to be encountering. So when we think about climate justice is really an attempt to reframe climate concerns in an ethical lens. So the idea that, for one, many of the populations that are at greatest risk due to climate change are the ones who really did the least to cause those problems. So you can think about that internationally in terms of who are most likely to be impacted by, say, extreme heat. But you could also look at that nationally as well in terms of who's benefiting the most from climate emissions and who's going to be harmed the most from them. And then you could also think of them even in the context of future generations. So our children, and the fact that they didn't cause this problem, but they're the ones who are going to be dealing with climate change going forward. So this is a frame for thinking about climate change that tries to focus in on those ethical responsibilities that we have to one another in the context of this complex problem. Now, when we think about environmental health, generally speaking, we find that environmental health threats do not impact different groups the same. So some groups are much more vulnerable, or we often use the term vulnerable populations to describe them, to these health risks. Now, there's a wide range of different vulnerabilities. Some examples of this might be being from marginalized cultures, racial and ethnic backgrounds that are marginalized, having less economic means to deal with these threats, the children and elderly who have sometimes greater health risks, generally speaking, and susceptibility to health threats, and then sometimes have differing ability to access healthcare itself. And then we have the people who are disabled or already experiencing various different health problems, and the way in which they might be disproportionately impacted by changes in the environment. And then there's some people who are genetically more susceptible. For example, people who might be at greater risk for asthma and the changes in ozone that we're expecting at ground level due to climate change. So when we think about this, it's important to remember that power and risks combine and multiply, right? So when you have marginalized groups, they're already facing a wide range of social risks. And when you add in these environmental risks as well, people are just much more likely to be harmed in these natural disasters or other types of long-term climate impacts. The other thing to remember here is that very often the people who have the greatest risks or are most marginalized and vulnerable are also the people who have the least capacity to get up and change, move somewhere else, or power to engage with the political system to make that political system deal with a problem, right? So there's an inequity here that is important to acknowledge and pay attention to when we think about environmental health issues. Now, the way in which marginalization translates into greater impacts varies, but a helpful way to look at this is to think about social determinants of health. And these are upstream factors that determine the extent to which health problems affect people. And this ranges from social status, support and alienation, whether people have access to food and housing, their educational levels and their ability to learn or gather information to deal with their health threats, their work situation, the stability of that work, the levels of stress that they're dealing with and the impact that has on health, whether they can get transportation, which relates to access and other things like that, the place that they're in and the type of environment that they're in, and access to health services. And these are things that sort of combine together with other types of vulnerability to impact people's overall health. So when we think about environmental health and environmental justice history, it's actually really important to think about this broadly in a context of understanding where this movement is coming from. So this movement is really powerful and really important. It has been going on for a long time. It's historically it has been the tendency of the powerful to put, risk factors like coal burning plants or other types of environmental exposures right in the backyard of populations that are marginalized. That happens across the board. When you look at these environmental threats, they tend to be located among populations that are most vulnerable. And the recognition of this has gone on for a long time. Cesar Chavez doing work with laborers around pesticides use in California. That's an example. But and there's other examples in New York State around communities fighting against different types of power plants and other things like that. But really, the environmental justice movement, as we currently understand it, was launched in 1982 during protests in Warren County against a hazardous waste deposit that they were going to put into their neighborhood. And basically what had happened is someone who had decided to dispose of a toxic chemical by just dumping it on the roads. So they had to scrape up all the soil next to the roads and they had to put it somewhere, and they decided to put it in a poor community that's primarily African American in Warren County, and where they would have to deal with the risks of these toxic chemicals. And this community rose up and made the argument that this is an environmental injustice, that is unfair that this community was chosen as a dumping ground for risks that could affect everybody, or it could be put in any location. It doesn't have to be in their backyard. And they fought this, and this actually gained national attention, which is why this is very much viewed as the launch of the current movement. But they didn't actually ultimately succeed in fighting that hazardous waste facility, but it did launch a lot of this national conversation. And later, in 1991, we have the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, where they actually put together a list of demands, essentially arguing that communities of color, communities that are marginalized, poor communities, need to have rights and recognition in decisions around environmental health and environmental risk, and that is a crucial thing. And, this is a global movement and a global debate and argument. And when we think about environmentalists, it tends to be a very white field. And it's really important to be paying attention to the environmental justice movement, especially in that a lot of these movements are led by people of color and communities that are at the front lines of these risks, particularly climate change risks. So, taking that seriously and recognizing that very often these communities are fighting against really high odds. They're fighting against corporations. Sometimes they're fighting against governments. Sometimes they're fighting against governments that are supporting corporations. And, the way that these are always ugly, hard debates and fights. But in other countries, very often it means those activists are being killed regularly. So it can be violent. It can be a really hard struggle. So it's really important as we pay attention to this to recognize and acknowledge the work of people of color and marginalized communities who are putting their lives on the line to push back. So coming back to some of the ideas around the fact that there are real disparities in terms of risks related to climate change impacts, I'll just give some examples. So one example, a global example here, is in La Paz in Bolivia, which is one of the poorest countries in South America. they are having a big problem because in La Paz, they rely on glacier water for a lot of their water. So most of the year they don't rely on it as much, it's about 15 years, but during this 15%. But during the summer months, it's 60 to 80% of their water is coming from the glaciers, but the glaciers are melting away. So in 2016, they had a terrible drought, which meant that they had to bring in water. They were having tremendous trouble with access. Farms were drying up, and there was food issues. They had to bring in the army to divvy out to provide water to the communities, and you started seeing violence erupt. For example, miners and farm workers fighting against each other because they were both fighting over a rare resource of water, which they needed for their jobs to maintain their livelihood. So, here we see where climate change impacts are having a major impact for poor communities. If we think about that, we move from the global examples to a national example. You could look at Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and that's a real devastating situation that they're still recovering from, where you had Hurricane Irma followed by Hurricane Maria. We had 4 hurricanes hitting U.S. territory within a summer, which these Category 4 storms are tremendously dangerous. Puerto Rico experienced land wind speeds of 155 miles per hour and devastated Puerto Rico, causing major damage. And what you see is they already had challenges with infrastructure. So the electrical grid, 80% of the electrical grid got knocked out. We saw that in terms of healthcare systems, people lost access to necessary services. And when we think about marginalization and the way that interacts with support and vulnerability, it's notable that the United States government did not do as much as it should have to take care of its citizens. Not the way that it responded, for example, to Hurricane Harvey. Not that there weren't problems there as well, but the government for a long time underplayed the impact of this. It was official government claim that it was only 48 people who died, when estimates are that it's more like 3,000 people who died in the storm, possibly more, and then many more people who had health issues than the economic damage. But independent organizations said, look, you're really failing Puerto Rico, and the people of Puerto Rico said that very clearly too. And there is a way in which it becomes quite obvious when you look at this dialogue and the way that Puerto Rico was ignored, that you can't think that there's a racist element to that, what happened there. And certainly a socioeconomic element to the extent of damage that we saw. So, this is one example to think about in the United States. We can also look at examples of climate change impacting our local region here in Washington State. So Washington State, we're seeing disproportionate impacts on local tribes. So we're seeing displacement. For example, the Quinault Indian Nation is having to move one of their villages due to sea level rise, where their village was flooded 2 years in a row, causing a great deal of damage. So they've had to actually move their village. There's actually a number of tribes that are actually very vulnerable, where a lot of these tribes expect that significant parts of their land are at threat of being flooded as sea levels rise and the surge levels rise. So these are real serious concerns that are impacting these communities. You could also think, just as another example among many, you could think about how disproportionately agricultural workers are impacted by climate change. So agricultural workers have very rigorous jobs, physically demanding jobs, that sometimes they have to wear heavy equipment that insulates them, and they're working in the middle of summer, in the middle of this hot days. And this is often also combined with the fact that they often have limited power, very often having low socioeconomic status and not necessarily having legal status in the United States. The way that they're treated by their employers doesn't give them the opportunity to say, I need to take a break, for example, or this is a real serious health threat. And therefore, it puts them in a much more vulnerable position. And we know that the majority of these workers are people of color and people of low income. So we see the intersections of multiple areas of vulnerability. And, when you're working outside and you're near wildfire areas, and we're seeing the impact of climate change on our local air quality, well, you're much more exposed to that smoke. We also know that a lot of workers are exposed to really high heats during the summer. So 79% of outdoor workers report having experienced some heat-related illness during the summer. So this is something that is happening and something that is likely to become a greater and greater problem as temperatures rise. So that's a local example of vulnerability in the region, and there's many others that we could use as well. So let's talk about measures and ways of looking at vulnerability in a broader way. We'll start off with global disparities, and we know that there's huge global disparities when we look at health systems, socioeconomic factors, etc. Now we know, just looking at sort of some raw measures, if you look at life expectancy versus income, you'll see that there's a 30-year from the age of about 50 to about 80, right? So you have about 30 years of difference in terms of life expectancy, which is a huge amount of time based upon where you live and how much money you have. And you see that there's a direct relationship between amounts of money and expected life expectancy. We also know that when we look at wealth across globally, that is not equally distributed, that there are a tremendous amount of wealth, which can make tremendous impacts on people's well-being, is really hoarded by a very small portion of the global population. About 70% of the global population only owns about 3% of the wealth. Now, wealth, again, is not income. Wealth is people's net assets, both in terms of their savings, but also in terms of, say, their ownership of land or other types of ownership. So, there's been a lot of research on this and looking at what the types of wealth that is held by very small amounts of people could do in terms of global health. And really, it could eliminate starvation, a whole range of these global health issues, if even small portions of that wealth that's held by some was distributed equally. So, this is a big issue. And, when we look at this globally, not only is that wealth unequally distributed, it's unequally distributed across regions. So here's just looking at global wealth of billionaires specifically as a proxy for looking at how wealth is distributed across the globe. But we see that it's very specific regions where the vast majority of that wealth is held, right? This is not equal in terms of people's access. And remember, wealth, money, etc., is really closely tied to people's power and ability to deal with climate change risks. So there's multiple ways that this has been looked at. One way to look at this was done by ND Gain, where they created these climate vulnerability maps. And what they did is they did a calculation where they measured vulnerability, which is measured through exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And this was looked at in the context of food, water, health, ecosystem service, human habitat, and infrastructure. And so that's sort of like the way in which climate change is going to impact people based upon those different factors, okay? Then there's also another element to this is the country's readiness to deal with the threats of climate change. And this are things like, how strong is their economic system? Do they have a strong governance system? And other social factors that might influence whether or not they can readily respond to the damage that climate change can cause. And based upon this, they essentially created the combined metric, which is called the gain index, where they combine those two measures together to look at readiness and vulnerability combined to see which countries are at greatest risk. So here's looking at global vulnerability, and this is based upon the way that climate change is likely to impact health risks in different communities. And you see that the red is where countries that are likely to experience worse impacts, and green is typically better impacts. And you see that much of that sort of relates to where they are in relationship to the equator and heat impacts. If you look at readiness, you also see a variety of capacity in terms of different countries to respond to these types of natural disasters of various sorts and long-term climate change risks. And if you combine them together, you see that there's a wide range of different types of impacts that different countries will experience. And it's notable that, you look, for example, at Africa, where, as I've mentioned before, the people in Africa right now are producing about 1/200th of the amount of CO2 emissions, that we are in the United States. It's a huge disparity in terms of who's causing these problems and who's going to be experiencing the harms of them. So again, this brings up the idea of equity, justice, and the real responsibility that we have to others around the globe. Now, when we think about United States vulnerability, I'm not going to go into that in as much detail. We'll talk about this more going forward. But, we know that this climate change is going to have a huge impact in the United States. We'll look at some more of that later. But if you just look at mortality from extreme temperatures, we can see that there's expected to be substantial increases in the rates of deaths due to extreme temperatures. And we know already, in terms of vulnerable populations, that vulnerable populations die at a much higher rate in extreme temperature conditions. So, this is very much a concern within the United States. But as a model and example of this, I'm going to talk a little bit about Washington State specifically. So, when we're talking about regional vulnerabilities, there's a range of different factors that we would consider. So, here's some data about different types of vulnerabilities that was put together in a report by Front and Centered, which I'll talk about in a second. But there's different ways you could think about it. You could think about it based upon where people live. Are they living in floodplains? Are they living in wild and urban interfaces where there might experience fires, for example? Or living in urban areas where you might have particular risks due to pollution and urban heat effects, right? You could also think about exposure based upon what type of work someone's doing. So agriculture, fisheries, or construction, where there's significant additional vulnerabilities for people in those professions. And then you could think about factors that affect vulnerability generally, sometimes for communities or individuals. So race and ethnicity, wealth and income, linguistic isolation, and you can read through there, age and health status, etc. But that there is a wide range of different factors that will play into why different groups might be vulnerable, and they might be vulnerable in different ways depending on what types of risks we're talking about, whether it's flood or heat or air quality, for example. Now, we know, as in the United States, that Washington also has a wide range of socioeconomic status and tremendous disparities. And that's partially due to the fact that, Washington State has no income tax. People who are poor get harmed. Our economic system is really terrible in the Washington State in the way that it distributes risks, although it does have in many ways some better social supports than other states do in terms of Apple Health or other types of support. But one of the ways that you could look at these disparities is looking at race and ethnicity within Washington State. And what you can see in terms of percent of people who are experiencing poverty, that this really varies. If you look across the different groups here, it ranges from about 10% in white populations up to 20% in American Indian populations, 27%. So and 24% in African American populations. So, and was it 23% for Hispanic populations, right? So you see that across different groups that there is a huge difference in terms of vulnerability, in terms of socioeconomic status and power to address these climate change risks. We also know that within Washington State, we have huge disparities. And I'll just mention some that are directly regional where we are right now. In Snohomish County, if you look at average incomes, it ranges from $55,000 per year in North Everett up to in Mill Creek, it's over $100,000 per year in terms of average incomes. That's almost double the income, depending on where you live, right? So we're talking a matter of tens of miles between populations who are making half as much money. That's a huge difference in terms of access to resources, right? And vulnerability as a result. We also see that this type of thing is reflected in life expectancy. So within Snohomish County, we have a 10-year difference in expected lifespan. 10 years, what would you give for an extra 10 years of life? Well, it turns out that living in the wrong place on average means that you lose 10 years of life. From Tulalip being about 73 years of age up to almost 87 here in Bothell. 83, almost 83 in Bothell, right? So that's a huge difference. That's a huge disparity, 10 years. We see similar numbers in King County. This is a slightly different type of data, but down here we look in King County, if you look at quality of life indicators measured as higher or lower, the darker is below average, you'll notice that those quality of life indicators overlap very strongly with the percentage of the population that's people of color, right? So there are real significant vulnerabilities and risks in this region that are a problem. So Front and Centered is an organization I just want to talk about a little bit. It's a statewide coalition of over 60 organizations that represent communities of color, for people of color and lower income communities. And they're really focusing in on economic and environmental justice. And one of the main focuses is on climate change. There's other organizations in this area, particularly specifically here, Got Green here in Seattle, and SAGE as well, are two organizations that really focus in on low-income and communities and people of color, communities of color, in terms of thinking about climate justice in our specific region. And we'll learn more about them outside of this lecture. So when we think about climate justice, what types of considerations might we think about? Well, these are what Front and Centered uses as their principles for thinking about climate justice. And one is just acknowledgement that we live in an unequal system, that we have a system that has been designed in an unequal way that privileges certain people. And that injustice needs to be acknowledged for us to be able to move forward and actually deal with that. The other real strong ethical push is that when we think about justice and these efforts, we need to allow leadership from the communities who are actually affected by these impacts, by these environmental impacts and disparities, right? And that as we're thinking about solutions, not only should we accept that leadership, we should also think about these economic, racial and economic considerations and sort of figuring out what decisions might make sense. We can also think about that in other areas and dynamics of marginalization as well. And trying to create strategies that target as many people as possible and create as many overall benefits for everyone as possible. And then also try and think about this in a positive way of thinking about how can these approaches that are taken to deal with environmental threats actually lead to benefits for communities of color and people with lower incomes, right? So how can we actually build and strengthen those communities? And we'll talk a little bit about resilience shortly. So one of the projects that Front and Centered worked on, and they worked on that with the Department of Health and UW School of Environment and other organizations in Washington State, they wanted to create essentially a way of looking at vulnerability to environmental health threats within Washington state. And this can be very useful for visualizing and understanding what types of threats we might be expecting and what types of communities we have to really help build and support adaptation and resilience, right? So what did they do? They essentially created a disparities rank within the state where they looked at environmental exposures and effects, the combination of those two, and then they multiplied it by essentially the proportion of people who are sensitive populations or impacted by socioeconomic factors. And they did this to sort of create an overall index to measure how vulnerable different parts of the state are. And these are the indicators that they use. They looked at environmental exposures like ozone or traffic density or other things like that. They looked at environmental effects like lead risk or wastewater discharge or things like in that category. And these are just proxies for looking at overall vulnerability. They don't necessarily measure all of vulnerability. And then they looked at sensitive populations. So the proxies that they use here are cardiovascular disease, rates of cardiovascular disease, and low birth weight of infants. So risk factors there in terms of health for sensitive populations. And then looked at socioeconomic factors, housing burden, poverty, etc., race, people of color who might be disproportionately impacted. Right, and they combine this data together to create a vulnerability rating. And what you see for our area, for Puget Sound area, that there is real distinct demarcation of different communities that are at much greater risk for environmental health threats. So when we're thinking about climate change and climate change impacts, this is a very helpful resource for trying to identify communities that might be disproportionately impacted and to provide support for them. So I want to talk a little bit about resilience as a framing for thinking about this. So we think about justice and we think about the idea of vulnerability and adaptation. And vulnerability is important for acknowledging that different communities are experiencing different types of risks. You don't only want to think about a population and the community as being vulnerable. You also want to think of them as being strong and having strengths. And that's the idea of using strength-based approach is in addressing communities and their needs. And resilience is a way of creating a positive framing where you acknowledge that there's risks and harms that are experienced by a community, but also that there's strength within that community and that they can build towards being able to successfully address and respond to these climate-related risks. So emphasizing the idea of renewal and that we can develop systems and socioeconomic supports and community systems and engage in innovative efforts to try and deal with these climate change impacts. So that's a really important framing and way to sort of address this in a more positive context. Now, when you think about resilience, there's different ways to talk about it, and there's many different components to it. But here we're thinking about not just the risk and vulnerability, although that's a component to it, but we're also thinking about how do we build connectedness with the community? How do we create strong community organizations that can advocate and engage in actions that support that community? How do we think about building resources that people can access as they need it when they're facing different types of risks and challenges? And how do we create plans and procedures to deal with emergencies when they do occur, right? So together, when you combine those different things, you create a community that is more capable and feels stronger in its ability to address climate change. So that's just a brief introduction to climate justice, vulnerability, and resilience. There's a lot to talk about here. It's really important and very interesting. A colleague of mine here is teaching a whole course on on environmental justice. There's a lot of really important, challenging ideas and conversations that are happening around that, and a real need for us to put that, as the organization says, front and center, to really make sure that we're attending to the people who are going to be most harmed and challenged in a changing climate. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that this was helpful for giving some context for thinking about ethical considerations in climate change issues. And take care, everyone.